Okay, so Chapter 2 in Unsafe in the Ivory Tower is talking about how we measure sexual victimization. You might recall at the end of Chapter 1, it talked about how do we know how much sexual victimization actually exists, especially since people tend not to report this crime. So, while studying the current research, the authors of your book concluded that we need some other way to measure this, because the two main ways they're sort of measuring this have shortcomings when used alone. But if you put them together, they could be pretty promising. So as they undertook what is now known as the National College Women's Sexual Victimization Study, they tried to put together these two types of questions. One was a screening question where they used those behaviorally specific questions to cue a respondent to recall if they'd been sexually victimized, and then a detailed incident report for each time that someone said yes. So let's start with some different measures here, and beginning with the National Crime Victimization Survey. So originally called the National Crime Survey, it's redesigned into the National Crime Victimization Survey during the late 80s, early 90s. And partially, the redesign addressed some shortcomings in how sexual victimization was being administered. So for those of you that don't know much about criminal justice and how we get our crime statistics, this is administered by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, and it's a national household-based survey. They use what's called a stratified multi-stage cluster sample. So they choose things for their sample in multiple stages. So they basically survey 90,000 individuals that live in housing units. So a housing unit becomes the subject, everybody who lives in that housing. So that could be an apartment, it could be a home. And the panels rotate every 6 months, and you remain in the panel for 3 years. So that means that there are 7 interviews that are done. One that's done at the beginning of the 3 years, and then the remaining 6. They only ask victimization information from people who are 12 and older, so it's not good for gaining any victimization data for children. And the 1st and 5th interviews are done in person, while the rest are done using what's called CADI. It's computer-assisted telephones. So it's a 2-step process in the NCVS. First, there's screening questions, and then if the person responds that indeed they were a victim of a particular type of crime, an incident report is done. The NCVS uses the incident report to figure out if what the person has described is a crime. Most other sexual victimization surveys only use those Q questions, but NCVS asks follow-up questions so they can properly categorize the incident. When they took place, what type of victimization it might be. So they ask 4 screening questions that assess whether or not someone has been attacked or physically threatened. And they assume this would prompt those who had been raped to answer yes. But they never asked about rape directly. So as a result, the NCS, the original survey, underestimated rape. They also didn't really ask about any other types of sexual victimization. So this redesign effort really focuses on cueing people in order to get a more accurate measure. So the new screening questions were added. They directly ask about rape, attempted rape, and other sexual attacks. All the questions were reworded, and new cues were added to better stimulate someone's recall. Most discussion focuses on questions 41A, 42A, and 43A, which screen for all personal crimes, and this includes incidents involving threats. Types of sexual attack is meant to capture a range of incidents. So looking at these questions, 41A assumes that the respondent knows how rape is defined, perceives what happened to them as rape, and remembers the experience with this conceptual label. But remember, Koss, in her sexual experience survey, found that only 27% of college women labeled what had happened to them as a rape. 42A screens for all personal crimes, but can be used to screen for rape and sexual victimization because it references potential offenders. And this really helps remind people that offenders can be someone who is known and not only a stranger. And that the incident level report allows for them to capture which type of victimization it is. And 43A provides a second chance to report a victimization. So these revisions are improvements, but we still want to be cautious. So this produces higher estimates in general and for rape in particular. Taylor and Rand reported that NCVS rates were 323% higher for completed rape and 96% higher than the original NCS survey. So we still cannot fully determine if those screening questions are able to cue all respondents. So looking at the incident report, Basically, they're going to tell you that forced sexual intercourse includes psychological coercion and physical force. Okay, as we discussed in class, it includes vaginal, anal, or oral penetration, which includes foreign objects, and the question also includes attempted rapes, so not just completed ones. Coss argues that the NCVS definition of rape is ambiguous in defining what psychological coercion is. It probably means verbal threats, but it could mean false promises, threats to end a relationship, continual nagging, etc. So it also assumes that respondents share a definition about what intercourse means. So 5 types of sexual assaults are operationalized here. An assault with a sexual attack with serious assault, sexual attack with minor assault, sexual assault without injury, unwanted sexual contact without force, and verbal threats of sexual assault other than rape. They're asked the same series of questions in the rape sequence, and so the difference is in the respondents' descriptions of how the offender attacked, tried to attack, or threatened to attack them. So the public assumes, if they know about these statistics, that they're a pretty accurate reflection of the rates of sexual assault. The key strength here in the NCVS is the incident report. So several features of this next generation of studies include that they've really broadened the scope of what they're measuring when they're measuring sexual victimization, and they're including coercion and unwanted physical contact. They're also looking at newly criminalized offenses such as stalking. They use nationally representative samples of women and use behaviorally specific questions. So they've improved upon Coss's work by being more explicit and providing definitions of what behavior the act included, and by having the incident reports. So another survey that is attempted to measure this is the National Women's Study. And this is done by Kilpatrick and colleagues. It's a longitudinal study from 1990 to 1992 of women 18 and older. So it's a probability sample, which is a random sample of just over 4,000 Americans. 2,000 women from the ages of 18 to 34 were oversampled. And it takes place in 3 waves of phone interviews. And they're looking at major mental health problems and alcohol and drug problems. So the first 2 waves collect data about forcible rapes in their lifetime and in the past 12 months in the past year. They don't use it to classify the incident. In wave 1, about 85% participated, and in wave 2, 81% of wave 1 participated. So they used very conservative definitions of rape. They looked at forcible rape and criminal sexual assault. Basically, an assault that occurs without the woman's consent. It includes use of force or threat of force, involves sexual penetration of the vagina, mouth, or anus. And attempted rape is not covered. And they have 4 questions that they use to operationalize rape. They brought in threat of force to include threats of harm to someone close to the respondent, but we're not really sure why they included that. So their findings include the fact that 13% of the women surveyed had experienced rape at least once, and just under 1% in the last year. Now their estimate is 5.3 times larger than the NCS estimate. So remember, we don't do the NCS anymore. It's been redesigned into the NCVS. But we want to be cautious here. The NCS only includes penis-vagina rape. It includes completed and attempted. It only includes people ages 12 to 18, or it does include people ages 12 to 18. Includes male and female, and the way they bound those time periods is different. So the NWS has a 1-year reference period, where the NCS has a 6-month reference period. So we can't really compare these 2 data sets. But they learned some good methodological lessons here. So the sample excluded high-risk groups, people that were at high risk to experience sexual assault, so women in college, women in the military, for example. They did have a clearly worded introduction, which provided cues. So they said that a sexual assault may have occurred even if it wasn't reported or disclosed, and they list people who could be offenders. And the wording also describes specific behavior. And so as we've talked about before, the behaviorally specific questions are really helpful. There are 3 major limitations here. So the definition of rape doesn't include incidents where the victim was incapacitated. They only measured completed forcible rapes, and they didn't have any checks to validate that the disclosures were rapes. Okay, our next survey is the National Violence Against Women Survey. This is done in 1998, and it's a survey on personal safety. And the respondents are asked questions about general fear of violence and incidents of actual or threatened violence. And it focuses on different types of perpetrators, and specific types of violence included sexual victimization, physical victimization, and stalking. So this was a nationally representative sample of 8,000 English and Spanish-speaking women 18 and older. This was completed using random digit dialing, which doesn't work as well today because most people don't have house phones anymore. They also they bound people by their most recent birthday. And then between November and May, they used that computer-assisted telephone interviews. They had a 72% participation rate, which is pretty high. So in order to measure rape, they said without the victim's consent, that involved the use or threat of force to penetrate the victim's vagina or anus by penis, tongue, fingers, or objects, or the victim's mouth by penis. And this included attempted assaults and completed assaults. They were influenced by the NWS, and so they had an introduction about the nature of the questions. They did a lifetime reference frame and asked behaviorally specific questions. The respondent was provided with a definition as to the type of behavior in question. And then they used the screen questions and not the perpetrator reports to classify incidents. So perpetrator reports are also included in this. The interviewer administers a detailed sexual assault report for each type of perpetrator. In the report, they're asked how many times that perpetrator assaulted or attempted to assault them, when it happened, and if there are multiple incidents, they ask about the first time and the most recent time. This is not bounded data. It is cross-sectional. So these are used to determine when the incident happened, not if the incident happened. They do provide separate estimates for both completed and attempted rapes. Then we have the National College Women's Sexual Victimization Study. And they said, why not take the best features of each study and combine them? Okay, so they have behaviorally specific, graphically worded screening questions and an incident report. So they wanted to look at victimization amongst college women and look at risk factors associated with victimization. So they have a random sample of female undergrad and grad students between 1996 and 1997, and it included just over almost 4,500 women at 233 institutions, and they used a two-stage probability sampling design. People got a cover letter first, then it was done with a female caddy, and their response rate was nearly 85%, which is very high. They developed their questions with the help of focus groups, and they pre-tested this with 100 female students at the University of Cincinnati. They measured 12 different forms of sexual victimization: rape, sexual coercion, unwanted sexual contact, and then various threats and stalking. And they grounded their definition of rape in legal definitions: unwanted penetration by force or threat of force, and they included attempts and completions. They used 12 behaviorally specific questions, and the reference period they used was since school started in the fall. So it was about a 7-month time frame. They provided an introduction to the study, and the rape questions were similar, if not identical, to the NWS. They had graphic descriptions, and for each incident, an incident report was completed. So they have 2 incident reports, one for rape, sexual coercion, unwanted sexual contact and threats, and one for stalking. The one that we're most interested in detailed the type of victimization, documented information about the characteristics of the incident, and it helped them understand the reporting behaviors of victims. So why do victims report or not report? The interviewer would ask if the incident was threatened, attempted, or completed, and they collected information on all 3, but recognized that an incident could involve multiple victimizations that escalate. Therefore, they classified them by the most serious victimization that occurred. They were asked about the use of physical force or threatened use of physical force. Their main findings: 1.7% of college women in the sample had experienced a contempt completed, rape since school had begun. So remember, that's a 7-month period. 1.1% had experienced an attempted rape, and 2.5% had experienced either a completed or attempted rape in their lifetime. So let's go back to that debate about Koss and Gilbert, right? So answering yes to a behaviorally specific rape question. The rape screening questions detected 314 incidents, and only a quarter of them were eventually classified as rape. 50% of the incidents entered via the incident report were classified as a sexual victimization other than rape. If they had included all 314 incidents, the victimization rate would be twice as high. So it would be 70 per 1,000 college women instead of 35. About a quarter of the incidents cued by the screening questions could not be classified. About 20% could not be classified because the respondent refused to answer. And just under 7% of incidents included ones where the respondent could not recall enough details to complete an incident report. Answering yes to a non-rape screening question. Answers to other screening questions might actually lead to disclosure of a rape. So when the incident report is done, it might turn out to be a sexual assault. And this did occur. About 50% of incidents classified as rape came in on a non-rape question. So, I mean, this really shows you just how important it is for that incident report to be in there. So, comparing two studies, looking at the National Violence Against College Women study. This was completed during this same time period, and it looked at rape, sexual assaults, and then we could see a variety of other crimes here. It has about a 92% response rate, which is kind of unheard of. Same reference period, measured victimization the same way. And the estimate of rape in the first project is substantially higher than in the second project. So the completed rapes are 9.5 times higher in the first project than in the second project. And that wraps up this chapter for us.